Good morning, everybody. So the title of my talk is really embedded to give you some idea of the various types of research that we can do if you decide to follow a career in marine biology within an academic environment. And I should actually point out that while you start your career as a marine biologist, you do your postgraduate studies, and there's a number of opportunities for you to exit that and then become an environmental consultant or work for NGO. But my field is mainly as an academic, and the area that I'm going to be interested is just very, very quickly give you an idea of the monitoring of marine top predators, why we do it, why it's important, and the type of technology that we can use to monitor these individuals. So give you some idea about my career path. The start of our studies is basically completing a BSc, and I completed my BSc at Rhodes University, where I majored in zoology and entomology. I then subsequently did a BSc Honours in Zoology, again at Rhodes University. And following that, I then decided to register for a Master's, which is ultimately upgraded to a PhD. And the PhD is the minimum requirement if you want to follow a career in academia. Time span, anything from 8 to 10 years, depending on the thesis that you do, including your undergrad. So my PhD was largely focusing on the response of the Antarctic food web to human activities. I was particularly interested in looking at how global warming is affecting marine ecosystem functioning. And that subsequently, once I'd completed my PhD, I then was appointed as a research officer, basically someone who's full-time just doing research, trying to understand key questions with regards to the Antarctic food web. And my work was mainly ship-based. So the picture at the bottom there is the Gullis 1. So we did a lot of our ship-based research, and a lot of the techniques that the previous presentation alluded to, we did exactly the same. We do net sampling, bongos, CTDs, etc. Then once I'd finished being a research officer for 2 years, I was then appointed as an academic, first year as a senior lecturer, and then associate professor, and then finally professor. And while I was at Rhodes, I was the head of department for 10 years. And then I also was director of the Southern Ocean Group, which was largely involved with looking at research around the Antarctic continent. In 2024, the beginning, I moved from Rhodes University to the University of Cape Town, where I established the Marine Ecology Group, which is based in the Department of Biological Science at the University of Cape Town. And the Marine Ecology Group is largely concerned with studying all aspects of marine biology, all the way from viruses, all the way up to charismatic fauna such as whales and dolphins. Okay, so just give you some idea of the work that we've been doing in the Marine Ecology Group. And again, these are mainly projects that are being conducted by students, usually full-time students. In other words, they're doing a master's or a PhD, although we have been able to incorporate students who are doing taught masters. So in this case, there's a component of classes, and then you subsequently do a mini research project. So depending on what you want to do, a lot of people prefer to go the taught masters component, with the idea of you usually exit that and you usually move then to environmental consultants who are working for non-government organizations. My students, generally all my students are actually doing research by thesis. In other words, they'll take 2 years if it's a master's or 3 years of a PhD, and they will then study specific aspects in a field of study. And the idea behind that is as you do your research, and you write up your thesis, you become competent, you develop competency in writing, critical thinking, and ultimately the competency in the field of science. Okay, so in my group itself, at this stage I have 12 MSc and PhD students working with me. And as I said, the majority of them are actually MSc students. And if we look at what we've been doing in the Marine Ecology Group, I can really identify 4 major themes. The first of these is the top is the marine microbial ecology, and here we've been looking at diseases associated with flying seabirds, and of course the charismatic, very important work that we've been doing on the critically endangered African penguin. And what we're looking at here is how microbial communities within the blood change according to the health status of the animal. So if an animal is healthy, can we get indications? Does it have a different microbiome to that of an animal that's unhealthy? So we can monitor, to a large extent, we can use this type of information to monitor ecological status and ecological health of ecosystems. The second areas, which is I'm basically going to talk about today, is monitoring marine top predators. And within the group, we have students working on whales, sharks, and manta rays. And of course, they're charismatic and it's really easy to attract students with this. But a lot of this work is involved in trying to understand the distribution patterns, looking at their feeding ecology, and I'll tell you why later on, why it's so important that we actually understand these processes. Then there's a group of students who are focusing on plankton food web, and plankton are basically small animals that drift in the oceans. Now, why we're interested in them is because plankton form the basis of the food chain. The vast majority of the whales and manta are actually feeding on plankton. So if we understand plankton, we understand basically food delivery to the top predators that we find in the ocean. And the last area of what we've been looking at is pollution. And I've been particularly interested in looking at plastic pollution, the ecological impacts of plastic pollution. Not only just the large plastics, but actually microplastics. Because what we do know now is that animals routinely eat these microplastics, and they have adverse effects in terms of the ecology. These animals often stop feeding, sometimes they stop reproducing. So the idea is to get an idea of how much of this plastic is being consumed and what ultimately determines the risk. So not all animals appear to be consuming microplastics at the same rates. So some groups are a lot more vulnerable to others. And obviously there's a potential issue here in terms of health for humans, because a lot of the animals that we know eat lots of plastic are what we can consume. And the best example of these are mussels. Mussels are exceptionally good at, or have very, very high rates of plastic pollution in them. And basically, whenever you eat a plate of mussels, you're eating anything between 300 and 500 little pieces of plastic, because it's embedded within their tissue. So we are particularly concerned, obviously, with regards to pollution and the effect it has, long-term effect it has on marine ecosystems. So what I really want to do now is, for the rest of the talk, is just focusing on an area of study that is basically filled with charismatic animals and relatively easy to be honest, to get students. And again, there is this idea that numeracy is important, being able to critical thinking, and of course writing, but by and large, the vast majority of students pick up those skills when they start in first year and they go through processes. So it's not like if you get into the system and you're not highly numerate that you're going to be at a huge disadvantage. Those skills are often learned, and that includes things like the use of R, a lot of statistical packages, which are often theme specific. So we have different areas, have different types of software that's utilized, and this is basically the skills that you pick up as you do your degree. Okay, so obviously one of the areas that I'm particularly interested in is looking at top predators. Now, most of us know what a top predator is. We're interested in them because they are really, really important consumers of prey, and because they consume large amounts of prey, they play a very important role in structuring ecosystems in terms of carbon flow and in terms of energy. And the other aspect with regards to the top predators is they're all incredibly highly exploited. Most of the commercial fisheries are actually based either on things such as tuna, sailfish, and of course there's been adverse effects such as shark finning, which kills enormous amounts of sharks, and then of course we have interesting things of seals. Now, one of the things I want to point out is that when we talk about top predators, there are large numbers of other top predators which are not so obvious. The first of these are birds. Birds are extremely important as top predators in marine ecosystems. And again, we're working with a lot of people like the Fitzpatrick, looking at people that specialize in birds. And to give you an idea, we think there's about 750 million birds that are in the marine environment which are consuming. Seals and of course penguins are very, very important. Now, one of the reasons why we're particularly interested in top predators besides the ecology is that we can use these top predators as what we call sentinels for change. We can monitor top predators and gain some information with regards to the state of the ecosystem which they found. And the reason being is that most of the marine top predators are subject to what we call multiple stress syndromes. So because they're on the top of the food chain, they will very, very rapidly accumulate the effects of things such as infectious diseases. They respond very, very quickly to food depletion, climate change, and anthropogenic contaminants, in other words, pollution. So if we can monitor these top predators, we get an insight into how that ecosystem is functioning. The absence of top predators usually is indicative of a system that is highly stressed and actually not ecologically functioning. So a lot of the work, as I mentioned, is basically, yes, we're interested in the ecology, but we're also very, very interested in monitoring their numbers, their distribution over time, because it gives us an integrated approach in terms of ecosystem management. Now, the issue with top predators, monitoring top predators, is it's extremely difficult. One is they're very, very mobile. Some of them, their ranges cover several thousand kilometers. Some of the very, very big top predators, and we think here about whales. They are really, really difficult to observe. And that's mainly because they spend most of the time underwater, and often they are found in areas which are not readily accessible to people. So the one way, and of course you can actually study them, is to go on research vessels. The problem with that is research vessels to run are extremely expensive to run. For example, something like the Gallus 2 costs about R750,000 a day to run. So we need to find alternative ways in which we can monitor these top predators. There is also, of course, things such as ethical considerations. You know, in the past, most of the research that has been done on top predators has involved destructive sampling. We go out to areas, we collect them, we kill them, we analyze them. But in the world in which we find today, that is frowned upon. We need to find ways which we call are non-invasive. In other words, we can monitor them without having any adverse effects on these top predators. So one of the solutions is to use what we call non-invasive new technologies which allow us to monitor marine top predators. And the two ways in which I'm going to discuss today is what we call acoustic tags, and the second aspect is what we call passive acoustic monitoring, or PAM. Okay, and again, as the previous spokesman alluded to, it does require a certain level of expertise in engineering and ability and be able to work with technology. But once you've actually got a grasp on it, it's actually relatively simple. So what are acoustic tags? Well, acoustic tags, South Africa forms part of what we call the Ocean Tracking Network, or OTN. And the OTN is a global initiative which was set up to monitor the movement of top predators in the world's oceans. And one of the reasons why it needs to be a global initiative is because many of the predators, their migration patterns are transboundary. So in other words, they move from South Africa to Australia or from South America to North America, which requires that we have global initiative. So basically speaking, what an acoustic tag is you put a small little acoustic tag either on or top of the animal that has got a specific signal and a specific number. You know the species that you're putting it on, and then as you release that species, it will then swim, and then we have along the coast what we call acoustic receivers. If that fish or whatever you're monitoring comes in close to contact or proximity to it, the acoustic receiver will pick up the signal. It will tell you the species and tell you when it found and the time in which it found. And if you've got these receivers over large areas, you can actually work out where these animals are moving without seeing them. Now, most of these acoustic tags are relatively easy to deploy. It's a colleague of mine, Ryan Daly. This is an acoustic receiver that he's deploying. It's in about 35 meters of water, so you can use scuba. And that structure here, that's the receiver, and it usually has a buoy, and that buoy ensures that that receiver stays within the mid-water. Now, there are, of course, problems with this. If the fish doesn't move close enough to the receiver, you don't pick it up. But it does give us a lot of information with regards to where these predators are going. And what we are particularly interested in is looking at where fish, or these top predators, breed. In other words, we can identify nursery areas, and we want to know what then happens to those offspring. Sometimes they stay in close proximity. Sometimes, as I'll show later, they move very, very vast distances. And that has important implications in the terms of the way we manage and how we conserve these animals, because it requires that sometimes small areas that we set aside for conservation are probably not enough to provide adequate protection for animals that are moving a lot. Okay, so in terms of these non-invasive, and I said this is not really too invasive, this is colleagues of mine. So what we usually do is we usually collect these sharks, rays, or large fish using hook and line. We'll bring them to the side of the boat, and then we'll attach a tag, acoustic tag. Now sometimes the tags are relatively easy to attach. So this is a tiger shark, and we've got an acoustic tag on its dorsal fin. Sometimes if the fish it's too small, we will then surgically implant an acoustic tag within its abdominal cavity. Now I know this sounds very cruel, but in reality, the whole process takes 2 to 3 minutes. And we know that within a week, that area where it's been cut open is actually healed. So it has no adverse effect on the fish whatsoever. No change, it doesn't appear to have any long-term effects in terms of their health. Now, as I mentioned, we're part of this ocean network, and along South African coastline, we actually have an enormous number of receivers. So every one of those black dots is a receiver that we've deployed, and we've decided to deploy them along the entire South African coastline. So the area in pink is the subtropical zone, it's along the coast of KwaZulu-Natal, and then we have this yellowish area which is southeast and eastern Cape Province, and then the blue is up the west coast. And you can see the bulk of the receivers that we've deployed are actually found along the south and the north coast of South Africa. So each one of those dots is a receiver that can detect a signal from a fish that has acoustic tag. It doesn't have to be your receiver, as long as, or the fish that you've mounted. As long as that receiver is active, it will be collecting data continuously. And then what you do, and at various intervals, you'll actually go, retrieve that receiver, download that information, and redeploy it. And of course, because it's a global network, we then have a database and allows people to gain access not only on the fish that they're interested, but other fish. There are issues with embargoes, and we do try and limit people who have access because there might be competing influences. Now, one of the reasons why if you look at the distribution of those receivers that we observe along the coastline, is that we've been particularly interested in looking at how marine protected areas, which are those areas in green, and you know what a marine protected area is, how those marine protected areas, how effective are they in terms of providing ecological conservation for these top predators. And so most of the work that's been done is actually looking at sharks. So we have a large number of sharks, white sharks, tiger sharks, we have rays, and we have a number of important lionfish. And basically this is the distribution that we observe. And you can see there's quite a high overlap in terms of the marine protected areas and where we've deployed these receivers. If we look at how these fish are moving, so these are the sharks, these are the teleosts, or the bony fish, what we can see is that the vast majority of these animals are migrating in excess of 500 kilometers, which means that yes, we can have a marine protected area in one area, but if they're moving 500 kilometers outside that area, they are at that stage vulnerable to exploitation. And one of the reasons why we're interested in this is because it allows us to think ahead and say, maybe there are areas that we haven't thought about establishing marine protected areas, which we should consider. And we do every once in a while proclaim a new marine protected area. So a lot of the sharks, which are heavily exploited, a lot of them are moving vast distances. This is this area here, this is the great white. So great whites are moving 1,500 kilometers up the coast, down the coast. I have a master student who's working on dusky sharks, and dusky sharks are unique in the sense they're typically found offshore and they come inshore where the females will pup. So she gives birth to live young, and she'll give life to anything from 6 to 10, what we call neonates. Now those neonates, we always assumed stayed around KwaZulu-Natal because they're associated with the sardine run. It turns out that those neonates are coming to Cape Town and coming back. And we were also, the other interesting thing, of course, is if you can tag enough of the neonates or the individuals, you do get an idea of how much has been lost in terms of predation. So those neonates, we lost 6 immediately. So there were 6 junior sharks, basically less than a meter, that were consumed. And it's not surprising because there's a lot of cannibalism and a lot of predation on early development sharks. So this is the type of information that we can get with regards to acoustic tags. The other, which is probably the least invasive, is using what we call passive acoustic monitoring. And passive acoustic monitoring really is the monitoring of sound in the oceans. And in this case, what we have is very similar, it's a more advanced form of a monitor. In this case, we have these large buoys. This is the hydrophone, in other words, it's an underwater microphone. And below that we have ADPs, which allows Doppler, which allows us to work out how much background noise there is as well. These things are typically deployed at anything from 200 meters up to 4 kilometers, depending on what we want to do. So we attach them usually where we have a very, very large concrete block. For these one, the concrete block is usually a ton, and we'll deploy it off the back of a ship, and it will be attached with a very long chain, and then the buoy will sit in the middle. So the system is actually drifting within the water column. These things can be deployed depending on what you want, from anything from 6 months to 14 months. What determines how long it's deployed is how often you're collecting the data. So most of these systems will collect data every hour for up to a year and a half. And what it does is collect 7 minutes of data for every hour. So if you can imagine how much data is being collected over a period of like a month or a year actually. So one of the reasons why we're interested in sound is because one of the things is sound is it propagates sound or water propagates sound very, very well. It's 4 times more effective in transporting sound. So any sound that is in the ocean that we detect actually can be detected very, very far away. And some of these systems we think can detect sounds up to 100 kilometers away, which is very, very unlike those acoustic tags where the fish has to be relatively close in proximity. One of the other reasons why we're interested in sound is that a large number of animals use sound in terms of their ecology. So they use sound for communication, mating, as well as feeding. And we can get very, very important information with regards to the behavior of those populations, because most animals will change their songs or the sounds they make according to different behavior. So what we get is what we call chattering. We get large numbers of individuals, whales that are just working and they're making noise all the time. And then they will change that sound if they start feeding, and then they will change the sound if they go into breeding cycles. So if we know what sound, the type of sound they're producing, and we can monitor that sound, we get insights not only in terms of presence or absence, but also in terms of the behavior. Now, one of the things that makes sound really, really nice is that sounds are distinctive. Each species has a unique sound that it makes. And those sounds actually act like a fingerprint. So this is the type of sound that a blue whale will make. So we can identify the peak call, the lower call, and we're looking at the duration. How often do we get breaks in that sound? That's a typical song that we observe. So that would be a blue whale. We then start looking at all the different types of whales. So this is a blue whale, this is a southern right, this is a killer whale, this would be dolphins. So each species has its unique sound fingerprint that it produces. Now, most of the sound is beyond the ability for humans to hear, and we use specialized computer software which we call Raven Pro, which slows that sound down and also stretches it out, so it allows us to look at different peaks and troughs in sound. But we can then, if we look at our data, we can then work out which species are where and what they're doing. And that's one of the reasons why this use of passive acoustic monitoring is so favored. You can collect enormous amounts of data. So if you're collecting all this data, you can actually break down your data and you can actually do multiple analysis on the same data set, because there's not much overlap in the different sounds that are being produced by the different whales. So what I want to do now is just focus on some of the work that one of my MSc students is doing. Her name's Emma Swan. And Emma Swan has been looking at monitoring fin whale populations off the west coast of South Africa. And so we have basically 4 hydrophones which have been deployed. The depth range anywhere from 200 up to 4 kilometers. So these are hydrophones which are sort of west of Cape Town. And what we're doing is we're just monitoring sound all the time. Okay, so why are we interested in fin whales? Well, this is the fin whale, Balaenoptera phylacis. It's the second largest whale on the planet. It's just a bit smaller than blue whales. The adults can reach about 27 meters in length and can weigh a maximum weight of 80 tons. They're extremely, extremely important amongst the whale population. At this stage, we estimate the global population is about 150,000, probably about 1/5 of what it used to be. Okay, very, very important. They were heavily exploited during the whaling era. Very, very heavily exploited. So what we do know about these fin whales is that most of them undertake, like most of these large whales, undertake these seasonal migrations. During winter, they'll basically be found in the equatorial regions, warm, where they calve. And with the onset of summer, most of them undertake either migrate in a northerly or southerly direction. So they'll spend the summer in the high Antarctic feeding, and they're mainly feeding on krill. Now, one of the things I want to point out is that the fin whales, particularly the yellow dots here, that is migration patterns that we know of fin whales. And we can see there's a lot of information available in the northern hemisphere, but almost no information known in the southern hemisphere. And that's one of the real problems. There's this big discrepancy between northern and southern hemisphere in terms of development and how much money has been allocated to do this type of research. So almost the absence of information in terms of the southern hemisphere. And because of the high levels of exploitation, and lack of information, biological data, they are listed as vulnerable to IUCN. It's this absence of data. We don't know what's happening in terms of the population. We don't know what's happening in terms of their movement. So Emma's work has largely been looking at fin whale calls. And as I mentioned, there's a whole lot of other groups. So we've got students working on sperm whales, I've got students working on killer whales, and now we're starting to look at what we call multiple feeding associations, seeing when we find whales together that are often feeding together, and one will often increase the success of feeding by the other one. So we're looking at quite a lot of complex interaction between whales. So what Emma's shown, so far she's analyzed 53,977 calls. Okay, so that's a lot of time, and basically, as I mentioned, she's using specialized software to analyze these calls. And what we do notice is that the fin whale calls consist of an upper region of around 99 hertz and a lower section of the call around 20 hertz. So that call sign that we get is typical of what we call the East Arctic fin whale population. So if we go to Antarctica, we know there's what we call a Western and an Eastern population. They differ in terms of their sound characteristics. So we know now, for example, that most of the whales we're observing are from the Eastern Antarctic. So they're coming past Cape Town and they go all the way from the equatorial region all the way to Antarctica, where they'll spend the season feeding and then they'll come back to calve in the equatorial region. One of the things I want you to look at this. So this is data which was collected from 2014, 15, and 16, and then there was a break. And then we had 2023 and 2022. And the colors represent different seasons. So what becomes apparent if we look at that in the blue, I want you to pay attention to the blue, is the blue, this is winter. So the vast majority of calls that we're detecting of fin whales off the west coast is taking place in winter, which means that a lot of those animals are either moving through the area or we call residents. They spend most of their winter time, our winter, off the coast of, east coast of, or west coast of South Africa. One of the things we have noticed, however, is that we're starting for the first time to pick up animals now being recorded in summer, which means that there may well possibly be some evidence of a change in migration patterns. And we think one of the processes that may be pushing is global warming. If the waters become too warm in the equatorial regions, which is the area where most of the warming is taking place, a lot of those male whales may actually move further south to avoid being overheating. So this actually might be indicative of change, and that gives you a good indication of why we monitor top predators in terms of looking at ecosystem health. Interestingly enough, if we look at the calls and the types of calls, this is just not to be concerned, but I said there's an upper frequency of around 99 and a lower around of 20. We can see over the corresponding time there's been a change in the types of call we're observing, as well as the duration. In other words, what's the time between those different calls. And our feeling is that the change in the frequency and the duration of the calls is evidence of a response of whales either to global warming, or there's some evidence that some of those eastern and western fin whale populations are starting to mix. And we think that's probably what likely happened in the past. They've become separated now because we've exploited them to such a limit that there's very limited exchange between them. As the numbers start to increase, and they are starting to increase, we're more likely to have different fin whales from different areas mixing. And what it does tell you is that the west coast of South Africa is a really, really important habitat, an important corridor for fin whales. And this work is critically important, actually, and it's an amazing finding by Emma. Okay, so one of the nice things about it, as I mentioned, is this idea of these non-invasive technologies, and they allowed us to monitor marine top predator movements and habitat requirements. And why is this important? Because it provides baseline information which can inform managements in terms of how we conserve these animals. One of the really interesting things that's taking place now is the advances in drone technology. I haven't used it yet, or our group hasn't, but there's certainly been pushed towards it. And as drones become more and more advanced, they give us really, really important insights into how animals behave, and particularly with regards to their ecology and how these different groups interact. So this is actual drone footage, and this image here basically shows how dolphins are interacting with sharks. they're not necessarily always spatially segregated. They do periodically interact. And I'm sure most of you would have seen an incredible drone footage of 2 killer whales eating a great white shark. That was drone footage. But in fact, some of the drone footage is actually giving us other ways in which we can monitor marine top predators. This is drone footage of bird colonies. And a lot of bird colonies are actually found on vertical cliffs where it's extremely difficult to do counts. And these guys have been using, this is in the northern hemisphere, but they've been flying these drones over these large colonies and getting estimates of bird counts, which is the first time they've been able to monitor it. And sadly, the numbers are down about 70%, which is not surprising because there's a lot of interaction between commercial fisheries and birds. The other aspect with regards with these drones is that some of the drones are of such high quality that you can actually use it to identify individuals. So as long as you're flying over the same areas, you can recount those individuals and you can get an idea of things such as their length. And if you know what their length is, you often can sex them. You can also work out if the females are pregnant. And because you can recount them, you can do what we call a simple mark recapture experiment, where if you count them enough times, it gives you a really good estimate of what the population size is. This study here is using exactly the same approach. This is using drone footage. And what they're able to do is they're able to determine the length of the seal. Obviously, they know what the species is. And if you can work out the length and you work out the width, you can work out issues with regards to what is the health of that animal. Because animals that are starving do not have the same body shape as animals that are healthy. So this is probably where the future is going to be in terms of a lot of marine studies, particularly when you're looking at behavioral and aspects. And what we don't know for a lot of these marine top predators is how they behave and how they respond to things such as noise. And the nice thing about drones is they're the ultimate non-invasive species, especially if they're electrical ones. So the idea behind it is this thing. We talk about marine biology. It is a very, very diverse field of study, depending on what you want, what your interest is. Obviously, there are lots and lots of people that are interested in marine top predators. But again, much of the research that is required is to try and understand what underpins these systems and what allows these systems to sustain these high levels of top predators. And there the field of oceanography becomes important because ultimately it's the physical environment that determines what's happening in that environment. And then, of course, food availability, which in this case is plankton. And to end it, I just want to thank my colleagues, Fani Shabanga from the Department of Forestry, Fishery and Environmental Science, and Ryan Daly from ORI. And of course, thanks to Emma for allowing me to use some of the data. Thank you very much.